very much for the invite, for hosting this event. Queer Artivism under COVID-19. I put a still from a second live here, a snapshot taken by a user of Pride Festival organized in Second Life. And to me, this summarizes the points I would like to make today around this health crisis, COVID-19, in creativity, intersectional solidarity that moves beyond sexual identity issues. And we also see a clear reference to Black Lives Matter and a digitally networked publicness that has been reinforced under COVID-19. I would like to start with a note on what queer artivism is, and then attend to COVID-19 and the digitally mediated spaces of queer artivism. And I will mention some key points before concluding with a note on the revaluation of public art today. So first of all, the queer artivism I see as arts practices.
Martin, sorry, we cannot see your screen. You have to share again your screen.
I hope this works.
Okay, now we see. Yes, now we see your screen. Thanks.
Okay, sorry for the glitch. I see as arts practices in public accessible sites which address or redress social marginalization through galvanizing critical thought and promoting inclusive change, unquote. So queer here I see as a creative tool, both in concept but also in practice, that I think is very useful in combating the COVID-19 situation, and also facilitating creative responses. What is important here is, again, this focus on more than sexual identity alone, so intersectional perspective, but also intersectional solidarity that intersects sexual identity, but also other social identity markers, including gender, age, ethnicity, geographical origin, religion, and so on and so forth is key. And in queer approaches and queer theory, I've been inspired by the queer collective Mary Nardini Gang. And they phrase queer as follows, quote, "Queer is not merely another identity that can be tacked onto a list of neat social categories, nor the quantitative sum of our identities. Rather, it is the qualitative position of opposition to presentations of stability, an identity that problematizes the manageable limits of identity. Queer is a territory of tension defined against the dominant narrative of white, hetero, monogamous patriarchy, but also by an affinity with all who are marginalized, otherized, and oppressed," unquote. So in that sense, I've construed public artivism as an attempt to challenge social structures that may preserve, underplay social inequalities and dominant uses of public spaces that have invisibilized the socially marginalized. And in that sense, I connected to a politics of activism as conceptualized by Kester, and where politics, moving on to Ronquier, is an aesthetic in that it makes visible what had been excluded from a perceptual field, and that it makes audible what used to be inaudible, unquote. And we see this visibilization of the invisibilized as well under COVID-19. And what it also raises is a question around the spatial politics of questioning, a reference to query, to put in question, how to commemorate LGBTQ plus history, memorialize victims of anti-LGBTQ plus violence, and promote social inclusivity through public art. And this is a question that also underpins my research project, Queer Memorials. But moving into COVID-19, I have a few notes that I would like to share with you. So COVID-19 and the digitally mediated spaces for queer artivism reveal some points around community building. So there are sexual and gender minorities, in some places they're still very much oppressed. But what we have seen in light of the cancellations of Pride events in the offline world is that it has opened up opportunities for marginalized and excluded communities to connect. So to re-find this sphere of intimacy, of a safe space through digital platforms for queer prides. And yeah, the Global Pride is one example thereof that I will touch upon more here. And an important notion here is co-creation. Co-creation, so beyond, across spaces, across time zones, we co-create works, we connect through public art, and some communities have been impacted by COVID-19 more or disproportionately than others, and in particular people of color who have found each other not only online, as we've seen, but also in offline demonstrations. But through creative acts, there is the hope to trigger social change and more inclusivity and the case for social justice. What we've also seen in the light of co-creation is how art has been seen as a bottom-up, well, a grassroots driven process, free to access, and in that sense, we could also think about, well, to what extent has the inclusivity been reinforced in light of COVID-19? There's also an element of contestation, the second C in this list, contestation through safer spaces. Also in light of a global pride, we've seen that those who often are, well, find threshold in expressing their identities in the offline world, well, they can participate through their bedroom, so to speak, so to contest social norms, heteronormativity in self-created safe spaces. And there is the element of commemoration as well. So whose lives are commemorized, whose lives are represented, and those kinds of questions about representation. A Global Pride 2020 is a particularly compelling event again, and it has taken place on the 27th of June. So that's very recent. And so in the element of intersectional solidarity is highlighted here. At the same time, this all-togetherness sometimes also raises a question about performative solidarity. So to what extent is the situation of marginalized populations really addressed by policy, legislation, and so on and so forth? And we see the same type of question in the Black Lives Matter movement. The co-president of Interpride argued that, well, people around the world are still very much isolated, LGBT people, but in the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen an emphasis on people of color's lives. And this is an example, bcbeingblack.com, how the stories, the lives of Black people are shared by podcasts, so in a very creative way in the online world. As a final note on the revaluation of public art, we've seen an empowering of the publics, the grassroots. We see how we've moved even further beyond institutional spaces, where do-it-yourself practices are promoted, where boundaries are more and more broken between the artist and the amateur. And we see also a reinforcement of inclusive publicness, but at the same time, there's competition for attention. There's competition for representation. Not everyone is connected to the internet in the first place. So what about the digital divide that may have been reinforced? And also, as a final note, we want to ponder on the role of institutions in the post-COVID-19 world. So finding a new way in the future as an institution vis-a-vis the grassroots that have become more and more digitally connected. Thank you very much for your attention.